My name is Emily Carter. I'm 24 years old, and the night my father decided I was no longer his daughter, I was standing on his porch bleeding into a hospital pad, holding a 3-day-old baby, and realizing with a terrifying clarity that if I collapsed right there, no one inside that house would open the door fast enough to save us. I didn't arrive thinking this would happen. That's the part people never understand. I didn't walk up those steps expecting cruelty. I walked up expecting disappointment, maybe anger, maybe a lecture I'd heard 1,000 times before. But underneath all of that, I believed there was still a line he wouldn't cross. I believed blood meant something. I believed a newborn meant something. I believed pain, real physical pain, would count for more than pride. Chicago in late November doesn't warn you before it hurts. The cold doesn't howl or dramatize itself. It slips in quietly, finds the weakest spots in your body, and tightens. My legs were already shaking from the surgery, my incision pulling every time I shifted my weight, and the wind cut through my coat like it wasn't there at all. My son was tucked against my chest, his tiny body wrapped in the only blanket I owned that wasn't still at the apartment I couldn't afford anymore. And every shallow breath he took felt like a countdown I didn't know how to stop. I remember standing at the bottom of the steps, staring at the porch light that hadn't changed since I was a kid, thinking about how many times I'd run up those same stairs after school, how many times I'd slammed that door during teenage fights, how many times I'd sworn I'd never come back. I remember thinking how ironic it was that the one time I needed to come home, I didn't feel like I was allowed to. I rang the bell once, not aggressively, not desperately, just enough to be heard. The sound echoed inside the house, dull and ordinary, and for a moment I felt ridiculous for being so nervous, like I was about to ask a stranger for directions instead of my own father for shelter. My son shifted against me, his face scrunching in that way newborns do right before they cry, and I rocked gently back and forth, whispering nonsense words under my breath, because I didn't trust my voice with anything real yet. When the porch light flicked on, my stomach dropped. I could see his shape through the frosted glass, tall and unmoving, and something in my chest folded inward like it had been bracing for this exact image for years. The door didn't open right away. I could hear movement inside, footsteps crossing the living room, the low murmur of the television, and then silence. That pause, that deliberate delay, stretched longer than it needed to, and in that space, doubt crept in. Not about him, about me, about whether I should turn around now before this became something I couldn't unfeel. Then the door opened. My father didn't look shocked to see me. He didn't look relieved or concerned or even angry. He looked inconvenienced, like I'd shown up late to a meeting he'd already decided not to attend. His eyes went to my face first, then dropped to the bundle in my arms, then came back up without softening even a fraction, and that was the moment I knew this was going to hurt more than I was ready for. I said his name quietly, because my throat felt tight and unreliable, and then I said, "I just need a few days," because I'd rehearsed those words the entire cab ride. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask how I was healing or whether the baby was healthy or why I hadn't called sooner. He didn't reach out or step aside. He just listened with that flat expression I recognized from 100 other moments growing up, the one he used when he'd already made up his mind and was waiting for the other person to finish embarrassing themselves. When I stopped talking, the silence felt heavy and wrong. Then he said calmly, almost gently, that I'd made my choices. He said I'd walked away once already. He said he wasn't letting me drag my mess back into his house now. The word mess landed harder than the cold, because he wasn't talking about circumstances or timing or bad luck. He was talking about me, about my life, about the baby breathing softly against my chest. I felt my face heat even as the rest of me went numb, and I tried again because I always tried again. I told him I was still in pain. I told him my stitches felt like they were tearing every time I moved. I told him I'd never have come if I had anywhere else to go. I hated myself for how my voice shook, for how small I sounded, for how desperately I still wanted him to change his mind if I explained it right. He sighed, slow and heavy, like I was exhausting him. He said this was exactly why he'd warned me. He said this was what happened when I refused to listen. He said he wasn't responsible for cleaning up the consequences of my decisions anymore, and he said it all without raising his voice, without drama, without cruelty in his tone, which somehow made it worse because it meant he believed every word. Behind him, I could see the living room lamp glowing warm and yellow, the couch I'd slept on during college breaks, the hallway that led to the bathroom where I used to lock the door when his mood shifted. I could see the life I'd grown up in continuing without interruption. And for one irrational second, I thought about stepping forward anyway, about forcing him to either push me back or let me pass. But then my son whimpered. The sound cut through me sharper than the wind, and a wave of pain tore through my abdomen so suddenly I had to grab the railing to stay upright. My body reminded me that I wasn't strong, not yet, not like that. And my father noticed the movement, noticed the weakness, and instead of reacting with concern, his expression hardened like he'd been proven right. He took a small step forward, just enough to block the doorway completely, and told me not to make a scene. He told me not to manipulate him with tears. He told me not to pretend this was anything other than the consequences of my own actions. When I whispered that it was freezing and the baby was shaking, he didn't look at us. He looked past me, out at the dark street, and said I should have thought of that sooner. Then he closed the door, not slammed, not violently, just shut, firm and final, and a second later the lock clicked from the inside, clean and unmistakable. I stood there staring at the wood grain, my brain refusing to accept what my ears had heard, waiting for it to open again, waiting for him to reconsider, waiting for proof that I hadn't just been erased that easily. It didn't open. My legs gave out before my thoughts caught up, and I slid down onto the icy steps, the cold soaking through my clothes immediately, my incisions screaming, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I curled over my son instinctively, trying to shield him from the wind with my own body as my fingers began to go numb, whispering to him that it was okay, that Mommy had him, that we just needed to rest for a second. The porch light flickered once, then steadied, casting long shadows across the yard. The house behind me stayed warm and quiet, the television murmuring faintly through the walls like nothing important was happening. My vision blurred at the edges, the cold turning distant and sharp at the same time, and I realized with sudden clarity that I couldn't feel my feet anymore. I tried to stand. My legs didn't respond. I tried to shout. The wind swallowed the sound. My son's cry thinned into something weak and reedy, and panic finally punched through the fog in my head, hot and desperate, because I understood then that this wasn't just humiliation or rejection. This was dangerous. This was time running out. I tightened my arms around him as best I could, pressing my face into the blanket, trying to share what little warmth I had left, and I thought about all the times my father had told me I was dramatic, all the times he'd said I exaggerated, all the times I'd swallowed my fear because it was easier than arguing. I wondered if this was what he'd meant all along, that my suffering would only matter once it was too late to inconvenience him. The street stayed dark and empty, the snow starting to fall harder, and just as my thoughts began to slow, just as the cold started to feel almost peaceful, headlights appeared at the end of the block, cutting through the darkness and the storm, growing brighter as they turned toward the house. I clung to that light with everything I had left, not knowing if it meant help or just another witness, but knowing that if it passed me by, there would be nothing left to do but disappear right there on those steps. I didn't wake up all at once. I came back in pieces, drifting in and out of something thick and heavy, like my body was underwater and my thoughts were floating above it, tethered by a thin, aching line. At first there was only sensation, warmth against my skin, a dull pressure in my abdomen that pulsed with every heartbeat, a dryness in my throat so intense it felt like sandpaper. Then sound crept in, muffled and distant, a low hum that reminded me of an airplane cabin, steady and artificial, not the chaotic beeping I associated with hospitals. The first clear thought that cut through the fog wasn't relief. It was fear. Where is my baby? The panic hit so fast my chest seized before I could even open my eyes. My hands twitched weakly at my sides, fingers curling and uncurling as if my body was trying to reach for something my mind hadn't fully formed yet. I forced my eyelids open, blinking hard against the blur, my heart racing as I scanned the unfamiliar ceiling above me. It was smooth, cream-colored, broken up by soft recessed lights that glowed warmly instead of glaring. No peeling paint, no flickering fluorescence, no cracked tiles. For a split second I wondered if I was dreaming, if my brain had created a kinder version of reality because the alternative had been too much. Then memory slammed back into me without warning. The porch, the cold, the door closing, the lock clicking, my legs giving out. I gasped, a sharp, broken sound that tore at my throat, and pain flared low in my abdomen, deep and insistent, reminding me exactly what my body had been through, even before the night on my father's steps. Emergency C-section, blood. Hands pulling me back together while I stared at a ceiling I couldn't see through tears. 3 days later, I'd been outside in the cold, trying not to die. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. White-hot pain ripped through my core, forcing a cry out of me before I could stop it, and strong hands were suddenly there, steadying my shoulders, guiding me back down. A woman's voice cut through the panic, calm and controlled, the kind of voice that didn't rise no matter how bad things got. "Easy, Emily. You're safe. Don't move yet." I turned my head slowly toward the sound, my vision swimming until it settled on a woman in dark scrubs standing beside the bed. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her expression composed but not cold, and she was already adjusting something at my side, checking a monitor I hadn't even noticed yet. My mouth opened, but no words came out, just a dry rasp that made my throat burn. "My baby," I finally croaked, the words barely audible, terror threading through them. "Where's my baby?" She didn't hesitate. She didn't tell me to calm down or wait. She simply shifted to the side and said, "He's right here," and followed the words with a small, deliberate gesture toward the far side of the room. I turned my head, every movement slow and painful, and that was when I saw him. A clear bassinet stood near the window, angled so I could see inside without straining, and there he was, swaddled tightly in a soft white blanket, his tiny face relaxed in sleep, his cheeks faintly pink instead of the frightening pale blue they'd been when I last saw him clearly. His chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm that felt like a miracle. I stared at him, afraid to blink, afraid he'd disappear if I did, and something inside me collapsed in on itself, a wave of relief so intense it left me weak. Tears spilled down my temples and into my hair without permission, my body shaking with quiet sobs I didn't have the strength to suppress. The nurse noticed immediately, handing me a tissue and placing a steady hand on my arm, grounding me. "He's stable," she said softly. "He was cold when he came in, but we warmed him quickly. His oxygen levels are good. He's a fighter." The word fighter lodged in my chest painfully because he shouldn't have had to be one. He was 3 days old. He should have been warm and protected and oblivious to the world's cruelty, not pulled out of a snowstorm by strangers. I swallowed hard and whispered his name, just to hear it out loud, just to remind myself he was real. The nurse smiled faintly, like she understood exactly what that name meant to me, then glanced at the monitors again, before explaining where I was in careful, measured terms. Not a public hospital, a private medical floor, specialized care, security on the doors. She said it like it was normal, like women didn't nearly freeze to death on porches and wake up surrounded by wealth and quiet efficiency. Where is this?" I asked, my voice trembling again despite my efforts to steady it. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. "New York." The word didn't make sense. It floated there, disconnected from everything I knew, and my heart started to race again as questions piled up faster than I could ask them. How did I get here? Who brought me? Why here? How much time had passed? What about Chicago? What about my father's street? What about everything I'd left behind? Before I could speak again, the door to the suite opened. I expected another nurse, maybe a doctor, someone in scrubs who would explain medical things in language I half understood and half ignored. Instead, a man stepped in who didn't belong to that world at all. He was tall, dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit that looked out of place against the soft, clinical backdrop, and he carried a leather folder under his arm like it was an extension of his body. His expression was serious but not unkind, focused in a way that made my stomach tighten instinctively. Behind him stood another man, broader, silent, his posture alert, eyes scanning the room without settling on anything for too long. Security. The nurse gave the suited man a brief nod, then looked at me. "I'll give you some privacy," she said gently. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." She squeezed my arm once before leaving, the door closing quietly behind her. The man in the suit didn't speak immediately. He stepped closer, set the folder carefully on the table beside my bed, and only then looked directly at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, and precise. "Emily Carter," he said. "My name is Daniel Price. I'm an attorney. I need you to listen carefully." Every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. Lawyers didn't appear at hospital bedsides without a reason, and whatever that reason was, it wasn't going to make my life simpler. I tightened my grip on the blanket, my gaze flicking briefly to my son before returning to Daniel's face. "Why am I in New York?" I asked, the question coming out sharper than I'd intended. "How did I get here?" "You were transported here after you were stabilized," he replied evenly. "A private medical team retrieved you and your son from Chicago last night." Private, another word that didn't belong in my life. "Who paid for that?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. "Because I didn't." "You didn't," Daniel said, cutting in gently but firmly. "This wasn't your decision. It was arranged on your behalf." My heart pounded harder. "By who?" Daniel took a breath, the first sign of hesitation I'd seen from him, and then he opened the folder. "Your grandmother," he said. "Margaret Hale." The name hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't even process the words. Margaret Hale wasn't a real person to me. She was a concept, a shadow, a warning. Growing up, my father spoke that name the way some people spoke about curses or diseases, always with bitterness, always with contempt. If I asked questions, I was shut down immediately. If I pressed, the consequences came fast and cold. "She's dead," I said automatically, my voice flat with disbelief. "My father said she was dead." Daniel nodded once. "She passed away 2 days ago." The room tilted. My grip tightened on the blanket as my mind scrambled to reconcile the timing. 2 days ago. That meant while I was still pregnant, while I was still in the hospital, while I was still believing my world was small and shrinking. "She left you everything," Daniel continued. I let out a hollow, disbelieving laugh that scraped my throat raw. "That's not funny," I said weakly. "I don't know what kind of mistake this is, but—" "It's not a mistake," he said calmly, sliding a document out of the folder and turning it so I could see my name printed clearly at the top. Emily Carter, black ink, official formatting, not a dream. "Hale Properties," Daniel said, like he was reciting something mundane. "The Hale Hotel Group. Their holdings, subsidiaries, liquid assets, and controlling interests." I stared at the page, the words blurring together into something incomprehensible. Hotels, properties, assets, those weren't things that existed in my reality. I'd spent the last year juggling rent, utilities, and grocery lists, counting diapers and checking prices twice. I didn't even own a reliable car. "You're saying," I began, then stopped because the sentence was too absurd to finish. "I'm saying your grandmother named you as her sole heir," Daniel said, effective immediately. My chest tightened painfully, not with excitement or greed, but with a crushing sense of wrongness. "Why?" I whispered. "Why would she do that? She didn't even know me." Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "She knew of you," he said, "and she spent years trying to find you." The words landed slowly, sinking in one by one, trying to find me. I shook my head, a weak, jerky motion. "That's not true," I said, even as something inside me cracked open. "If she wanted to find me, she could have. My father—" "Your father stopped her," Daniel said quietly. The silence that followed was suffocating. Daniel reached into the folder again and pulled out several envelopes, worn and creased, each stamped with red ink. Returned, refused, undeliverable, all addressed to the same house. My father's house, the one I'd just been locked out of. I stared at them, my mind replaying memories I'd never questioned before. The mail my father sorted alone, the letters he threw away without comment, the way he'd snapped at me when I brought up my mother's side of the family. He filed a harassment complaint against her, Daniel continued, his voice steady, claimed she was unstable, obsessive, that she was trying to interfere in his family. My stomach twisted violently. That's insane, I whispered. She was my grandmother. She was also wealthy and persistent, Daniel replied. And your father understood how to use the system. The realization hit me like ice water. My father hadn't just lied. He'd built walls, legal ones, paper ones, walls that kept me isolated, dependent, small. I thought about every time he'd told me the world was dangerous, every time he'd said no one else cared, every time he'd made himself the only option. I felt sick. Daniel handed me another document thinner than the rest, a letter, handwritten. This is from her, he said, to you. My hands trembled as I took it, the paper warm from his grip. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and painfully personal. I read the first line, then the second, then the third, and my vision blurred completely. She wrote about regret, about time stolen, about doors slammed in her face. She wrote that she never stopped looking, that she believed I'd find her when I needed her most, that she hoped I'd forgive her for failing sooner. She wrote that I was never a mistake. The sob that tore out of me was raw and unrestrained, my shoulders shaking as grief crashed through me in waves. I cried for a woman I'd never met, for a life I never knew I could have had, for the years I'd spent believing my father's version of me was the truth. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't rush me. He simply waited. When I finally looked up at him, my eyes burned and my head throbbed. My father doesn't know, I said, the words half question, half plea. Not yet, Daniel replied. A chill ran through me despite the warmth of the room. What happens when he does? I asked quietly. Daniel closed the folder, his expression hardening just slightly. That, he said, is why we're having this conversation now. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the exhaustion and the grief, something cold and sharp began to take shape. Because for the first time in my life, I understood that my father hadn't just left me in the cold. He'd erased me. And men like him never let go quietly when they realize the thing they threw away has suddenly become powerful. By the time Daniel finished speaking, I understood something that took me 24 years to learn and only one night to feel in my bones. Surviving wasn't the same thing as being safe, and safety wasn't the same thing as freedom. The days after that conversation blurred together, not because nothing happened, but because too much did, all at once, in layers my mind could barely process, while my body was still stitched together and aching. Doctors came and went, checking my incision, adjusting medication, explaining recovery timelines in careful, neutral language that didn't acknowledge how close I'd come to not needing recovery at all. Nurses rotated in quiet shifts, memorizing my son's feeding schedule, commenting on how alert he was, how strong his grip felt when he wrapped his fingers around theirs. And every time someone said strong, I felt a twist of guilt, because strength had already been demanded of him before he should have known what the word meant. Daniel came back every day, sometimes with folders, sometimes with just his phone and that same measured expression, and each visit peeled back another layer of the life my father had controlled so completely I hadn't even known to question it. He showed me timelines, not emotionally, not dramatically, just dates and filings and address changes that lined up too neatly to be coincidence. Every time my grandmother's investigators got close, my father moved us. Every time a letter made it through, he returned it unopened. Every time a call came in, he blocked the number. He didn't just isolate me, he curated my reality. I kept waiting for the anger to explode out of me, for the kind of rage people talk about in hindsight. But what I felt instead was a low, grinding pressure in my chest, something heavy and cold that sat there and refused to leave. Anger would have been easier. Anger burns fast. This was slower. This was the realization that the man who raised me had spent my entire life deciding what I was allowed to know, who I was allowed to love, and how small I was supposed to stay. On the fourth day, when I could finally stand without assistance, Daniel brought me the piece of information he'd been holding back, not because it was less important, but because it was more dangerous. He didn't ease into it. He waited until I was seated, my son asleep against my chest, then said, "Your father has retained a family law attorney." The words landed quietly, but the effect was immediate. My stomach dropped, my grip tightening instinctively around my son, and every muscle in my body went rigid, like it had learned this reaction a long time ago. I asked what for, even though I already knew. Daniel didn't pretend otherwise. "He's claiming concern," he said. "Concern about your mental state, concern about your stability, concern about the baby." I let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sob, something sharp and broken that startled my son enough to make him stir. I rocked him automatically, whispering nonsense under my breath until his breathing evened out again, and the familiarity of that motion grounded me just enough to speak. "He locked us outside," I said. "He watched me bleed on his porch." "Yes," Daniel replied, "and he's already reframing it." That was the moment something in me finally snapped into place, not loudly, not violently, but with a clarity so sharp it scared me. This wasn't just about money or inheritance or old family wounds. This was about control, and control doesn't disappear when it's challenged. It adapts. Daniel explained the strategy plainly, because pretending it was anything else would have been an insult. My father was positioning himself as the responsible party, the concerned parent stepping in to protect an infant from an unstable mother who disappeared under the influence of unknown wealthy individuals. He was laying groundwork, creating doubt, planning language that would matter later if things escalated. "And will they?" I asked quietly. Daniel met my eyes. "If you stay passive, yes." That word, passive, stung, because passivity had been my survival skill for most of my life. Don't provoke, don't push, don't escalate. Keep the peace and you'll be allowed to exist. But peace had almost killed us. The next week became a lesson in how power actually works, not the dramatic version people imagine, but the procedural, boring, relentless version that lives in emails and filings and quiet phone calls. Daniel introduced me to another attorney, then another, specialists who spoke in measured tones about documentation, about evidence, about how narratives are built long before anyone steps into a courtroom. They asked me to recount the night on the porch in detail, not for sympathy, but for accuracy. Times, temperatures, words used, where my father stood, where the baby was positioned, whether anyone else was present. I answered everything, my voice steady even when my hands shook, because something in me had shifted. I wasn't trying to convince anyone anymore. I was preparing. The footage arrived 2 days later. Daniel didn't tell me what it was before he played it. He just asked if I was ready, and I nodded, bracing myself for something abstract, maybe photos, maybe reports. I wasn't ready for video. The screen filled with grainy nighttime footage from across the street, a security camera mounted on a neighbor's garage that happened to capture my father's porch in the corner of the frame. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough to see me standing there. Enough to see my father open the door. Enough to see him step forward and then step back. Enough to see the door close. Enough to see me collapse. I watched myself slide down the steps, curl around my baby, and disappear into the darkness at the edge of the frame, and something deep inside me finally cracked all the way open. Not into tears this time, but into resolve. This wasn't my memory. This wasn't my word against his. This was evidence. Daniel paused the video at the moment the door shut and looked at me. "This," he said, "is why we don't rush." I understood then what he meant. My father had spent years controlling the story. I didn't need to fight him head on. I needed to let him speak long enough to bury himself. The decision came quietly, without drama. I didn't announce it. I didn't cry about it. I told Daniel I wanted to meet the trustees. I told him I wanted to understand the companies my grandmother built, not because I planned to run them immediately, but because I refused to be a figurehead in my own life again. I told him I wasn't going to hide, and I wasn't going to strike first. I was going to wait. The meeting happened in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched out below like something unreal. The trustees were respectful, cautious, curious, and none of them spoke down to me, which surprised me more than anything else. They didn't rush. They didn't pressure. They explained what my grandmother had planned, the safeguards she'd put in place, the training programs she'd funded quietly long before her death. She hadn't just left money, she'd left a roadmap, and in that roadmap was a clause Daniel had waited to show me. Any request for emergency funding, loans, or bailouts under the Hale umbrella would be routed through a private review committee during the transition period. Anonymous on the surface, discreet, designed to protect the estate from opportunists during moments of upheaval. My father submitted his request 3 days later. He didn't know it was me. Not yet. He didn't know the daughter he'd locked out was sitting 10 floors above him, reading his words on a screen. He wrote about hardship, about loyalty, about family businesses struggling under unfair conditions. He framed himself as a man asking for help, not a man who had thrown his own child into the cold. Daniel asked me if I wanted to recuse myself. He said it carefully, professionally, like he expected me to. I didn't answer right away. I reread my father's words, the familiar tone of grievance and entitlement wrapped in respectability, and I felt something settle in my chest. "No," I said finally. "I want to hear him say it." The meeting was scheduled for the following week. I didn't sleep much the night before, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that whatever happened next would end something forever. Some doors only close one way. I strapped my son into the carrier myself that morning, my hands steady, my body stronger than it had been on that porch but still marked by it, and I walked into that building with a calm I didn't recognize as my own. I watched from behind the glass as my father took his seat, adjusting his jacket, rehearsing his smile, and when he started to speak, I realized something else with startling clarity. He hadn't changed. He still believed the story belonged to him. When I stepped into the room, when his eyes found mine, the shock on his face was real, unfiltered, and for the first time in my life, I didn't shrink from it. I let him see me standing there, healed enough to stand, strong enough to speak, holding the child he dismissed like an inconvenience. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't have to. The truth did the work for me. The fallout was quieter than I expected. No shouting, no dramatic confessions. Just consequences unfolding the way they always do when lies finally meet light. His loan was denied. His leverage evaporated. And when he filed his final attempt to reclaim control through the courts, it failed under the weight of documentation he never knew existed. The judge's ruling came down clean and final. Custody stayed with me. Visitation suspended, no contact. I thought I would feel victorious. What I felt instead was free. Weeks later, when I declined the application that came through my foundation bearing my father's name under a different address, a different story, I didn't hesitate. I marked the box and closed the file. Then I went home, sat on the floor with my son, and let him knock over the block tower I'd just finished building. The price of staying would have been my life. The price of leaving was everything else, and I paid it gladly.